what is very important is why. So I think now we are live, right? That's you never know for sure when we are live. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us in this webinar on Life for Nature. The LIFE program is, of course, a well-known program for nature protection and biodiversity from the European level. And we will tell you all about, well, the ideas and how it's constructed from the EU level, but of course, also very important, the experiences, and in this case, experiences coming from the Netherlands. Why this webinar? Very important is that this year should also be the year of biodiversity. When we are talking about the Green Deal, the big priority of the new European Commission, a lot of people are talking about climate change, but one of the most important issues that is until now maybe getting some less attention, and which is unrightfully so, I would say, it's the issue of biodiversity and nature protection. By the end of the year, also the Commission is planning to come up with some proposals, including also a restoration proposal. So you will see that biodiversity will be high on the agenda, also internationally, because in the International Convention on Biological Diversity, it's planned in this fall in China. And what a lot of people are saying is that should be the Paris moment for biodiversity. And let's see whether we can make that happen. But then, of course, we also have to show some good examples from the European side. And that's exactly what we are going to do here in this webinar for the coming 1.5 hours. We have a lot of very interesting guests. Later on, I will introduce you also some panelists coming from the Netherlands. But first of all, and you see them already there, I would like to introduce high guests from the European Commission. First of all, that's Humberto Delgado Rosa. He's Director of Natural Capital of DG Environment of the European Commission. And you also see Angelo Salsi. He's Head of Unit of Life Environment. So he is kind of the responsible at the European level for the LIFE program. What we will do first is have a bit of information from the European Commission on the LIFE program and on the experiences that we have seen until there. So I think without further ado, I would like to give the floor now to Humberto and welcoming you. Good morning and very good to see you. Has been a while. And I hope you're all doing fine. And I think I would like to give you the floor first on, well, what you expect from this year on biodiversity, nature protection, nature restoration, and of course also the role of the LIFE program into that. So Humberto, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Bas. Good morning to you, also to Angelo. Very pleased to be with you all that are following us. Let me try to use 5 minutes to set the stage on LIFE versus the current nature and biodiversity policy context. My first point would be reinforcing what Bas already said. Indeed, we face nowadays 3 crises that are all related to nature. The first one is the biodiversity crisis in itself, with this immense loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services that is well reported by science, and which is indeed fundamental to sustain us, to sustain our economy. Then we have the climate change crisis in itself, which is also a nature crisis. There's a very close link between biodiversity loss, climate change, and we cannot fix one without the other. And second, we had the COVID-19 crisis, which is in itself as a zoonosis, a pandemic derived from wild animals, also related to nature destruction and overexploitation. So when the crisis, the corona crisis came in, some have thought, oh, off goes the European Green Deal, doesn't it? Well, it did not, because indeed it does deliver also for health purposes. So I will spare you from the staggering figures. We all know about the state of nature. The direct drivers of loss and ecosystem degradation are known for long, but well ranked. We know the first one is land and sea use change. The second one is direct exploitation. The third, climate change in itself. The fourth, pollution of all kinds. And the fifth, invasive alien species. Now, one could think, well, but if this is known for long, what was EU policy about it? Well, in the last 4 decades, there's indeed a EU-built legal and policy framework that aims at good stewardship of Europe's biodiversity. And actually, when we think of the topic of this event, we know the LIFE program, it was launched at the same time and specifically to serve the Habitats Directive, which was approved in 1992. So one could first think, well, then it failed, didn't it? If we have a bad situation on nature and biodiversity in Europe included, what happened with LIFE European policy? Well, the fact is, no, it did not fail, very particularly the LIFE program. First, the situation in the EU would certainly be much worse if we did not have the Birds and Habitats directives, and especially also if we would not have the LIFE program. Actually, there are fantastic success stories from restoration, species recovery, land acquisition. My colleague Angelo will tell you more about that on the report Bringing Nature Back Through Life that was published in last October. But indeed, what LIFE could deliver was within its capacities. Let's say the rhythm of degradation just outpaced the rhythm of recovery, restoration, and nature protection. So, in my view, the European Green Deal, it is indeed a reply, a political reply to an increased public perception of how bad things go in the overall environment. So indeed, and Bas referred to it, in my view, the big novelty of the Green Deal is not climate change, as important as it is, it covers the whole environment, biodiversity included. That's why we do have the response to the nature crisis from the EU side, which is the most ambitious biodiversity strategy we ever seen, the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030, that it is exactly undertitled Bringing Nature Back into Our Lives. So a title very in line with the one of this event. First, we are now looking forward to the opinion of the European Parliament on the strategy after having had good reception from the Council, the Committee of the Regions, the Economic and Social Committee. So that will be an important next step. Finalizing, just a couple of words on how LIFE is more directly linked to the main elements of the Biodiversity Strategy 2030. It does have many components, but it builds around two important keywords: protect nature and restore nature. And on both of them, LIFE has a very important role, as it had in the past. First, we are now aiming towards an enlarged trans-European nature network, as we call it, covering for sure the Natura 2000 network derived from the Birds and Habitats Directive, but also covering national protected areas and other equivalent conservation measures to bring us up to 30% protection on land, on sea, 1/3 of which should be strict protection to leave nature essentially undisturbed. Now, of course, all the activities from the LIFE program can help us build on this, including ecological corridors for this coherence of the network. We are actually working now with both the European Environmental Agency and the member states on criteria and guidance to help designate new protected areas and also manage them more effectively. On restoration, as Bas also referred, the Biodiversity Strategy announces that we will come this year, let's call it a nature restoration law, which will have binding targets for nature restoration. We are still impact assessing the initiative, so things are still open. I can tell you the approach we have in mind is probably around a broad overarching goal for restoration in the long run, up to 2050, but coupled with a number of specific targets across the main ecosystem types in the mid-run for 2030, 2040, probably under a two-phased approach. First, those ecosystems we can already measure, we have data to measure, and the second row of those where we still need to develop the appropriate monitoring and indicators. And again, I do think LIFE will remain very important for nature restoration. So, Bas, thank you very much, yourself, other MEPs, for their continued interest and engagement on the topic of biodiversity. I will welcome questions and discussions in this event and look forward to listen to Angelo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Humberto. And indeed, the European Parliament is still working on its reaction on the biodiversity strategy. Hopefully, will be adopted quite soon. But you can imagine that there is a large support for what the Commission has put in its biodiversity strategy. And we are indeed very much looking forward to the nature restoration law, as you put it, by the end of this year. And then, of course, also the big question is, what will be the role of life in there? And that brings us, of course, very logically to Angelo Salsi, who is the head of unit, as I already said, responsible for life environment. And Angelo, I'm eager to listen to your experiences with the LIFE project and also how you see its role towards bringing nature back. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Bas. Thanks, Humberto, for the introduction. I have a slideshow. I guess that the organization will put it up for me. Great, it's coming. It's a great pleasure to be in the house of the fathers of life. As you remember, the European Parliament is not only the forefather, but is still the stepfather nowadays. And without the European Parliament, to be frank, there would be probably no life. And certainly life would be very much different than what it is today. So thanks to this institution, really a lot. Now, next slide, please. I want to recap for you a couple of figures of what life, nature, and biodiversity has meant throughout these almost 30 years. So 1,800 projects, 3 billion EU funding, projects that targeted 750 species, 5,400 habitats. So the Little Life program that started in '92 with a few 10 million ECU at the time, brick after brick, you see that it's becoming more than simply a little program. Next slide. And therefore we wanted, as we did already in 2004 when we issued a document called Life for Natura 2000, we wanted to see through facts and figures if indeed life was worth the money that we receive from the taxpayers and if it delivers. And that's why we have set out to produce this document, which is called Bringing Nature Back Through Life. Next slide. So here you see a sort of a shopping list of what life has been doing throughout these 30 years. It's by far, obviously, not exhaustive. And it's clearly very generic, but it identifies a couple of issues on which indeed Humberto already mentioned. One of them is what I used to say, Natura 2000 would not be the way it is without life. Here we say growing the Natura 2000 network. In reality, in some countries, it was really setting it out. The rest of the list, you can read it by yourself, but once the regulation on invasive alien species came out, we were there ready. We had already financed more than 150 projects on alien species, so we became immediately the spearhead of the regulation the day after. Next slide. A few facts on, in this case, on habitats. You can see here the various classes of habitats and the number of projects that have been targeting those. So that's interesting. But what it's more interesting is a couple of figures. Again, small is beautiful, but small after small after small, it makes medium, if not even big. So 170,000 hectares is a lot of land, and in this case of mires that have been protected in the UK thanks to life. 40% of the Belgium's peatlands, they have been protected through life, and the list can go on for a long time. So we didn't, as Humberto said, we didn't reverse the loss of biodiversity, but where life operated, indeed, it was a major step ahead. Next slide. And the same happens for species. For species, it's even more, if you want, telling, because there you go down to single species. Some of those are even very emblematic, but we wanted to list here a few that are coming less to the minds of people, like in the case of bats, in the case of invertebrates, in the case of fishes. So species that they are not immediately making the news on TV or in the newspapers. But we have a very long list of species that you will be able to bring to China and say, yeah, okay, we didn't stop the loss of biodiversity, we didn't revert it, and you can start listing all the species and habitats on which indeed, this was made possible, and it was made possible by the LIFE program in connection, obviously, with the European policy on nature protection. Next slide. So what is the extent of the coverage of LIFE and in terms of Natura 2000? Natura 2000 is huge, as you know, is the largest network of protected areas in the world. And we obviously did not manage with our resources to cover the whole network, but still 20% of all the sites have been targeted at least once by a LIFE project. 200,000 hectares have been purchased and they are protected forever, for as long as you can think of, if you want. The Marine Natura 2000 network, we made it alone LIFE, made it jump by 100% in 5 years. So you can see that little money, when well spent, can deliver macroscopic results, and last but not least, even very emblematic results. A single LIFE project, a Spanish project, delivered as a result the Natura 2000 Day, which we celebrate now every year on the 21st of May. Next slide. So now the future of LIFE. We have more resources, thanks again to the co-legislator that believed in this program, and in particular we have more resources for biodiversity and nature. But I put ... I have to tell you that it's a very nice message to send, but at the same time is also very sad. I mean, we have year after year a growing list of reserve projects, so projects that we cannot finance because we don't have enough money. And it's amazing the number and the quality of those projects. This year alone, we could have had twice the budget and we would have invested it in ready-to-go projects that would have saved another tons of species and habitats. We have decided to go for a further and more flexible approach in terms of the rate of co-financing. So there will be a higher rate of co-financing for many more species and habitats, including those in the EU Red List. So it's not anymore only the one with the little asterisk that we call the priorities. We will pay more attention, as we have already done in the past few years, on the less visible biodiversity, invertebrates, minor plant species, and so on. We believe that private land conservation will be a major tool in the hands of the European Union to make biodiversity really the biodiversity strategy succeed. And we believe a lot in capacity building, so in the governance element of LIFE, and in local initiatives. In reality, LIFE is very much a people's program, and LIFE Nature even more than the rest of LIFE. And last but not least, we want to do good, what is written in the legislation. We want to find all the possible synergies with the other EU programs. LIFE alone cannot deliver, but LIFE plus can do a lot more. Next slide. And here I have finished, I think. Thanks, Bas. The floor is yours again.
Thanks a lot, Angelo. That was very good to have. There is Humberto again, indeed, because I was expecting you as well, and maybe just one question to you, Humberto, first. If you're now, I mean, looking at our biodiversity targets, right, that we are now putting there for 2030, but of course you can also say, well, Europe has said we want to stop the loss of biodiversity. We already promised that for 2020. We did not meet those targets. So what, to your assessment, is now really crucial in order to make sure that we are going to meet those biodiversity targets that we are going to put forward for 2030?
Well, that's really an excellent question, because we can think, okay, very nice, you do again biodiversity strategy with nice words as the previous ones. Why will this one deliver? I think there are two fundamental elements. One is, let's say, the measurability element. We humans tend to act more when we have some targets, some numbers that we can go to. Now, of course, it's much easier to measure CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere than to measure what's related to ecosystem services, biodiversity, and nature, because it's more complex. but science is helping. And if you take a look into the biodiversity strategy, you find a lot more of measurability, so measurable targets. The second element, I would say, is essentially policy coherence, which is what the Green Deal aims at. I mean, if you look into the drivers of biodiversity loss, land use change, CO change, exploitation, pollution, often they are components of other policies, not of biodiversity policy as such. So in that sense, it is this good maestro that the Green Deal is and can be, that may ensure that we align the several sectoral policies and thus attaining measurable targets that reverse the picture, I would say. And life will remain an important element in all that, of course.
Maybe on that part, what could be the role of life into that, to meeting those biodiversity targets and to really have nature restoration, which is so crucial in Europe? How do you see the role of life in there?
Well, I actually had the benefit of having the LIFE program under my own directorate for a couple of years, not any longer, but there I really could capture how it is a special program. It's not only because it's dedicated to climate and environment, it has a special soul, if I may put it that way, which is, yes, it's demanding for the entrance. You must have a good application. It's a competitive process, but when you get in, you get a huge support to deliver. You're followed up. So I think this is this mix that has ensured a very special delivery. So I think life has always had, let's say, a special demonstration role. It's not research, but it can show up, a result that can then be picked up by other funds. To tell you just a little personal story, I was once in Slovakia, I think, and we were in an excursion, and the guide was telling us about a degradation situation. I don't remember exactly what, but then he said, luckily there was this live program that has shown how to reverse it, and here's the good result. It was something related to rural development that could be then be followed up on rural development. So I still see it in this angle of helping to the policy coherence, in essence.
That's a good example indeed. Angelo, well, you told a lot about this already, of course, but maybe for you personally, what makes you most proud of the LIFE program? If you see all those different projects, and it's good to hear somewhere that you have so many projects that could be funded even, are kind of in the waiting line for the budget. So that shows that it's certainly in the nature movement, it's a very visible program. What makes you now most proud in this LIFE program, in the achievements of the LIFE program?
I would say that it's a mixture of what Humberto said, the soul story, and the inner flexibility of the program, which is a mixture of the mechanics of the program itself, and also the people that are behind the program, both in terms of management of the program and the recipients of the beneficiary. And this flexibility can play a crucial role in policy terms. I'm going back to the early days of LIFE. By June 95, member states had to submit the first list of sites for Natura 2000. We had financed inventories that led to this famous list of sites in 6 countries, the size of Italy and Spain, just to give you the names. The only one country made it on time. It was Italy, thanks to the LIFE project they received, and they were very proud of. The day after, we had to say, what do we do now in those sites? So management plans. There was hardly any management plan agreed for Natura 2000. And so many countries started LIFE projects to establish guidelines and methodologies for the management plans, and thousands of management plans were then financed. So this gives you the flavor of the capacity of LIFE when you manage it well to respond to immediate needs of the policy implementation. Now we have the new targets from the Biodiversity Strategy: 3 billion trees, 25,000 free-flowing rivers. Well, of the 3 billion trees, 500 million most likely will come out from a single LIFE project, actually stemming from your country, Bas. So that's something to be proud of. The 25,000 free-flowing rivers, kilometers of free-flowing rivers, we have key performance indicators under LIFE that are telling us that more or less 10% of those might come from the project that we financed during the period 2014-2020. So it gives you the feeling that LIFE is able to respond immediately to the policy. So it's able to anticipate, to respond, and this is probably the thing I'm most proud of, is this ability of the program, like if it was a sort of a brain in itself, to adapt, respond, and fit, and even promote, act as a sensor. Humberto knows how many times we came with, but Humberto, we should do this because we see this on the ground. And some of those things that we saw were later on transformed in lines that appear in guidelines, in policies, and so on and so on. So that's really the beauty of the program.
And indeed, my experience is that the LIFE program is well known in the European Parliament. It is true that I think within the European Parliament, and certainly the committees responsible for biodiversity and environmental issues, LIFE program is always something that we want to fight for, and indeed fighting for getting a higher budget, basically, because it's such one of those very clear European programs that is delivering on the ground. How is your experiences with the capitals? That's the other co-legislator, the member states, because our experience is that the LIFE program is very much supported on the ground in the different member states, but not always so visible in the capitals. How are you trying to improve the visibility of the LIFE program there?
But the situation is, in reality, not so bad. I mean, across the years, we have always received quite a frank support from the council, and it's one of those. Obviously, there were disputes, negotiation, compromises, regulation after regulation. But I would say that if the Parliament was indeed really, you could see it was the protecting its baby. Then the council was not really attacking it, if you want. I mean, it's, and in that sense, the countries and the capital are usually from very supportive, especially in certain countries. You really have you feel the support. We have prime ministers that were project managers in LIFE. We have minister of environment that were project managers in LIFE. So, by the way, it's a nice, interesting thing to put in your CV if you want to have a political career, apparently. But apart from these jokes, I mean, I hardly can really tell you one country that was adamantly against it. Yeah, when it comes down to money, obviously, there is always a bit of discussion about saving here and there. But overall, everyone acknowledges that if you put money into the LIFE program, it's money well spent.
Good. And Humberto, maybe last question to you for now. There will be a panel discussion later on, so I will ask you to stay online, but we will, of course, very soon invite our guests from the Netherlands on their experiences from the practical side, so to say, and then later on you will come back together. Just one final question to you, Humberto. It's on this legally binding target for nature restoration, what will be quite of a new thing into biodiversity policies from the EU level. Why and how do you think the Commission is going to put that forward, and why is that so important? Maybe just important to stress that difference that we can expect by the end of the year.
Well, I'll put it this way, that restoration is important, we all know. There's actually the UN decade on nature restoration kicking in. And indeed, it is a single word which brings a message of, yes, we can solve it. We can do something, not just doom saying there's something, we can put it back. So, but now the novelty is not as much restoration as such, because if you take a close look to the Habitats Directive, the Birds Directive, there's a duty to restore, to ensure favorable conservation status implies that you need to restore. So, but in that specific case, there's no deadlines. And second, not all ecosystem types are covered by the current legislation. And third, and that's a very important one, singled out in the biodiversity strategy, we need nature restoration for climate purposes, to maintain carbon sinks and to adapt. So I think what will come now is first the evaluation as such. The impact assessment is crucial, so that we know which are the ones that we can really do, measure, and make something sensible and achievable for member states. And then we will certainly target those ecosystems more relevant for climate and disaster risk reduction purposes. And as I said, we may consider, let's say, a second step, like in having a system of assessment, monitoring that would allow further ecosystems later on to be included. The degradation is quite widespread, so we should indeed have something that ensures restoration of the main ecosystems in Europe. I hope this replies to your question. Can't be much precise because we are still developing it.
No, I know, and it will be there at the end of the year. So, but thanks giving a bit of an insight in there what is coming and what will be different or at least innovative compared to what we have seen until now. So thanks to both of you for now. As I said, we now will turn to our Dutch speakers who will give their experiences with the live program from the nature conservation side, and then around 10 o'clock we will be back in a panel. So stay online and hope to see you back in half an hour. Thanks a lot for that. And we can now turn on to the next part of this session, of this webinar. And that's, as I said, now moving to experiences from the nature conservation side. And for that, we have 3 speakers. And I'm sure they will be coming online there. See, it's really smoothly going there. First of all, Theo, good to see you again.
Good morning.
Good morning indeed. Theo Wams, he is the Director of Nature Conservation for Natuurmonumenten, the Dutch nature conservation, how do you call it, association. And you are responsible for the management, for the care and development of nature areas and cultural historic elements of Natuurmonumenten. So that's a big part of Natuurmonumenten where you're responsible for. So probably it's good to hear from your side, your experiences with the LIFE project and also its achievements in a pretty densely populated country like the Netherlands, where nature is always under pressure, given that being densely populated and having a lot of economic activities at the same time. So their nature conservation is always a challenge, and looking forward to hear from you on how you have seen the experiences with the LIFE projects from your perspective.
Thank you very much, Bas. Good morning, everybody. It's indeed an honor to be able to give you some insight in our experiences in the Netherlands with nature restoration. And like Bas said, I work for Natuurmonumenten, which is a private membership organization of some 760,000 members. We manage about 110,000 hectares of nature sites. Well, the Netherlands, it was already said by Bas, it is an agricultural dream. It's very fertile, it's very flat. So basically every patch can be used for agricultural purposes. And that's why right from the beginning in the early 20th century, Natuurmonumenten had the strategy to buy land, set it aside as nature reserve, manage it. And that indeed was quite a successful approach. We saved many sites that would otherwise have been turned into agricultural land, but later on, we found that simply setting aside and managing nature reserves, it was not enough. Our sites had to deal with pressures from the outside. You know the words, eutrophication, acidification, desiccation. But moreover, we saw that the remaining surface of nature was simply too small for biodiversity to be viable and sustainable. So that's why the Dutch government in the early 90s launched an ambitious plan to create a national nature network. And that network incorporated existing nature sites, but added new acreage that should be converted to nature and connectivity zones between nature sites. So after a first phase of purchasing and managing remaining patches of natural land, we went into a phase of expanding and connecting. I will give you a few examples. The picture you see here is the Groene Jonker. This is an expansion of 107 hectares next to an existing much larger Natura 2000 site. It's located between the cities of Amsterdam, Utrecht and Rotterdam, and it used to be farmland. In some places the soil has been excavated, and now it is a marshy wetland with a very high ornithological value. The people you see there are most certainly bird lovers. It's part of the Dutch Nature Network, And in general, it's our experience that conversion of farmland to wet types of nature almost always gives instant success. The next example I have, also I would like to have the next slide, please. It's an island. It's a small island called Tiengemeten in the estuary of the River Rhine. This is south of the port city of Rotterdam. This used to be an agricultural island. It was transformed to nature, thereby creating an important stepping stone in this ecologically very important estuary. The development of this nature island Tiengemeten was part of the LIFE grant scheme. It is now part of the Dutch Nature Network and the Natura 2000 network. And it's good to mention that beside its natural value, it is an important visitor attraction with 2 museums, a visitor center, a tavern, and even a mental health care facility. This is a good example to show the importance of the LIFE grant scheme. It cannot be overestimated. LIFE has hugely contributed to the quality and size of Natura 2000 network in the Netherlands. So these 2 examples are examples where we solely targeted on creating nature and biodiversity. Other ecosystem services, such as recreational value, they are an extra, a bonus. But in the next phase, we discovered that combining several societal needs with the aim of biodiversity gain from the beginning, that is in the design of the project, that can be a hugely powerful driver for ecological restoration. Under the heading of natural climate buffers, we have a coalition of organizations creating showcases of restoration projects that serve many goals, such as flood protection, drought protection, carbon sequestration, water purification, recreation, landscape, biodiversity. And I also have an example of that. So the next slide, but then again, the next one. Sorry, I don't have time to talk about Markerwadden today. This is the Groninger Onlanden. That is next to the city of Groningen. There we created a site, actually together with the water board. We created a site of 1,750 hectares, which is called the Groninger Onlanden. It can be used to store water in peak periods, and it's a huge success. Nowadays, otters roam there, but also it already saved the old center of Groningen from flooding a couple of times. And it is a well-loved recreational area for the inhabitants of Groningen. So we had phase 1, setting aside, phase 2, expanding and connecting, even building new sites. They're both successful phases. We need to continue them, but they're not enough. We still see insect dieback, nitrogen deposition on Natura 2000 sites, the threat of extinction of our national bird, the black-tailed godwit, which is a meadow bird. All these threats still continue. So we really feel we need to move beyond the strategy of separating nature from other land use functions and move to phase 3. That is integrating biodiversity into all forms of land use, including agriculture that accounts to almost 2/3 of our country. A first step in this transition to what we call nature inclusive farming could be taken in so-called transition zones. That is zones around nature reserves, especially Natura 2000 sites. These transition zones don't need to be dark green in themselves. They can be multifunctional, but they must contribute to the favorable conservation status of the neighboring nature reserve. And these zones can be breeding places for nature-inclusive farming and thus an example for the transition of all farming to sustainability. And to our opinion, the Common Agricultural Policy can and should be investing in this. I have my final example, which is, next slide please, this is called Rotterdam de Boer op. I will not try to translate that. It's a project with support from the postcode lottery, and it aims to enable local farmers. This is all in the neighborhood of Rotterdam, in and around Rotterdam. It aims to enable local farmers to make the transition to nature-inclusive farming in an economically viable way. It brings together the city and its farmland, and thus creating a local market for farmers and consumers, and also connecting people with their local landscape. For biodiversity, the goal must be more meadow birds and typical plants and insects. And the participants are not only farmers and consumers, but also supermarkets and other actors in the food and supply chain. If I look at restoration legislation, I would like to state that the existing birds and habitats and also the Water Framework Directive already contain a lot of good restoration obligations. They should be implemented and enforced. And new restoration law should not be duplicating already existing restoration obligations, but it should be a bit additional to these. So moving into what I just called phase 3, biodiversity improvements in the broader countryside. And for the Dutch situation, I see 3 spearheads, you could say, real added value. First, restoration of peat meadows, where current farming methods are leading to extreme soil degradation, large CO2 emissions. And restoration would bring biodiversity gains, climate change mitigation, and adaptation. Second, enable the creation of climate buffers, which next to biodiversity gains will host all kinds of ecosystem services. And third, create the transition zones that I was talking about around the Natura 2000 network, helping the Natura sites, enhancing biodiversity of the transition zone itself, and thus pose an example for the way to go for the wider agricultural landscape towards nature-inclusive agriculture. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Theo. And I think a couple of those points we can also come back to in the panel discussion also when Angelo and Humberto are back in there as well. I would now like to give the floor to Hetty Klavers. Hetty is chair of the Water Authority Zuiderzeeland, which I would say is a typical Dutch thing. It's land reclaimed from the sea, right? So that's what we Dutch are known for. So you have been working on these issues, and I think it's nice to really have your perspective on biodiversity and water management, and from a water authority perspective, where you have a lot of experience on. So happy to give you the floor, Hetty.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Bas, also for your kind invitation to join this webinar and the panel discussion later on, and of course for your introduction. It gives me a real pleasure to tell you about biodiversity and the Water Authority. It's a beautiful opportunity, this webinar, for us all to put the spotlights on biodiversity and its importance to our planet. And of course, it gives me the opportunity to show you how the Dutch water authorities are working on biodiversity. As a start, let me tell you something about water management in the Netherlands. We have 21 regional water authorities in the Netherlands, covering the whole country. We are, by law, responsible for flood defense, water management, and urban wastewater treatment for all our citizens. All water authorities have a democratic board in which all relevant stakeholders are represented, such as nature organizations, landowners, farmers, and industries. But the majority of the board is elected through direct elections. I'm very proud of our democratic system. We work closely together with other governments, the national government, of course, but also with provinces and municipalities. We also have an association called the Dutch Water Authorities, and all 21 regional water authorities are members. Let me zoom in on our work on biodiversity. In our day-to-day water management, we recognize the negative trend for biodiversity, and its decrease goes faster than ever before. This is very troublesome and stimulates us to integrate biodiversity objectives in our legal duties on water management. To do so, our association, the Dutch Water Authorities, has developed a joint vision on biodiversity, a so-called bio-compass. A normal compass has 4 directions. Our bio-compass has 5 directions, and we call them key principles. Next slide, please. The first principle: we recognize our responsibility for biodiversity as one of the public values we serve. And on the next slide, the second principle: We are part of a green-blue network we want to make stronger. Theo just showed you some examples of this green-blue network. Green stands, of course, for the shores and the flood defenses, and blue stands for water. This green-blue network consists of unique connections between land and water. This network is in the Netherlands completely man-made, but offers nevertheless tons of opportunities for nature. And since water management in the Netherlands is an ongoing task, we can strengthen biodiversity every day through our projects and activities. Next slide, please. The third principle, we can make a big difference with small interventions. For example, sowing a dike with flower seeds is fantastic for biodiversity and the eye, of course, and it is at least as strong as traditional grass if you do it well. Next slide, please. The fourth principle, we consider biodiversity with each task. Biodiversity is not a special in our work, it's part of our work. Our work goes further than the do no harm principle. We want to add value. Next slide, please. The fifth and last principle, we work together with partners. We work not only with the other authorities, but also with NGOs. A wonderful example of the latter is the project called Catch the Water Monsters. Beautiful title. This is a citizen science project of a Dutch NGO named Biodiversity. And of course, we work also closely together with Theo's association, Natuurmonumenten. Our biocompass with the 5 directions guides us in our work and efforts. It's fair to say that although we are on track, we have not reached our destiny yet, and we are facing, of course, some challenges. First, there's the issue of money. It's often thought that incorporating biodiversity in projects costs a lot of money, but it's almost nothing compared to the budget for dike improvement. We spend every year €500 million on dike improvement in the Netherlands. Biodiversity costs lots of money is a myth that cannot easily be disproved. Just like the myth I mentioned before that a dike with flowers is weaker than a grass dike, which is not true, and even the experts have to admit this. Secondly, due to climate change, we are facing more and more dry summers and water shortages in a water-rich country like the Netherlands. Who would have believed that some decades ago? This is certainly not good news for biodiversity. As a result, we have to adjust our water management drastically, and we are now committed to re-wetting, water retention, and restoring waterways and streams. And finally, for the Netherlands, there's much to gain to improve the implementation of national and European legislation by putting more emphasis on supporting policies. You can't blame it all on the farmer if implementation of legislation comes without a supporting policy with a new perspective for the farmer. To finish off, Bas, there's already a lot of legislation to improve biodiversity. The Green Deal, however, with the Farm to Fork strategy, with the Biodiversity Strategy, and the subsequent reform of the EU Environment and Agriculture legislation, this Green Deal can provide a welcome new boost for biodiversity recovery that really works. We have to aim high. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Hetty. And maybe just one question directly, if I may, because you have so much experience in it, but could you give some good examples on where water management can really deliver on our nature restoration targets, so to say, because that's maybe sometimes forgotten, but water management by itself, how could that contribute to achieving those biodiversity targets?
Well, water management in the Netherlands has gone a real long way. First, we just wanted to get rid of all the water when it fell down, but nowadays we are looking much more at the water system as a whole. And I think that if we can look at the water system as a whole and including biodiversity, then we can make a real leap ahead. And of course, we as water authorities are managing a real jewel in the crown, I may say, if we're speaking about biodiversity, because we are managing also the land-water connections, and that's really unique. So water management is there, it plays a key role, I think, in restoring and upgrading biodiversity.
Okay, thanks. We probably will come back to that later on in the panel discussion. Thanks for now, Hetty. And then we go to our third speaker, and that's Danielle. She is director at Wij.land, which needs to be explained for a non-Dutch speaking audience, I guess, because Wij.land means meadows, but it's also literally us land. It's we. And I think that also very much symbolizes what the foundation is at, because it's really meant to let the different people and organizations work together for nature protection and restoration. So that's probably also why the name is such a good name already, putting this corporation into the name. But Danielle, I probably can give you the floor to explain it much better, and also your experiences on how nature restoration can be achieved in a country where there are so many actors living together so closely.
Exactly. Thank you, Bas. So I will show you several slides, but thanks, Bas. Yes, so Wij.land is a wordplay, because Wij.land spelled differently means meadows, and Wij also means us. So it's our land, and we are working together with many organizations, and I hope I got my slides on. But the story of Wij.land really starts in 2016. As the mother organization of Wij.land is called Land. Land is working towards restoration of landscapes throughout the world, internationally. Next slide, please. And so they are taking a perspective of balancing returns. So instead of putting financial returns from the landscape at the top priority, as in economic returns, we have to find new ways to balance returns on natural capital, social capital, and financial capital. And it starts with returning inspiration. This is the Land approach. Next button, please, because then it will slide in how we work in a landscape approach. Can you press? Yes. So we work in large landscapes where we take a holistic view on the various zones, if you like, you can find in a landscape. So we're not looking only in natural zones or nature protection areas. We're not only looking towards agricultural productivity or agriculture in economic zones. We're taking a holistic view over the landscape, because as in the Netherlands, I think is very obvious, these zones are so much interconnected. Anything you do in an agricultural zone will have its impact on a natural zone and vice versa. So you have to take this holistic perspective. And next button, please. We take a long time span as well in our projects. We take 20 years. So it's not a project, as in you get project financing for 3 to 5 years, and then you have, the project money dries out and then you're gone. Because we need a long-term commitment on the landscape, and we need a long-term transition, we have to realize that transitioning towards balancing these returns in the landscapes takes time. It takes a generation or 2 decades to restore biodiversity and other values in the landscape. Next slide, please. So Land is working internationally, and two projects are situated in Europe. There's the Altiplano in Spain. It's an area about approximately 1 million hectares, and there is Wij.land in the Netherlands. And next slide, please. We are working in the Western peat meadows. So all the pink you see in the map of the Netherlands is peatlands, and all the green that you see are designated nature reserves. This is for Commonland perspective, a small landscape. It's 125,000 hectares that we work in, but it has a lot of stakeholders because it is, as we explained before, it's a very busy landscape. And this also provides an opportunity because there's approximately 10 million people living in the bigger cities in this landscape. And my background is that I'm a physical geographer and a soil scientist, and I was always mesmerized by how we know soil subsidence is a huge problem, how we know climate change is being impacted by oxidation of peat, and that we make all these visions and we make all these plans, and that transition comes so very slowly. So my personal take on this was that I wanted to learn what is actually needed to get real movement and real on the ground impact, and what it takes for farmers to make that change to different farming methods, or putting the water tables higher, or so what are the barriers, but also what are the opportunities? And the opportunities are here. And I think more than ever, the focus is on the urgency, the sense of urgency that we have to change it. But we have only one generation to change this. Next slide, please. But then where do you start? Well, we're mostly privately funded. We're a very small foundation. We have 10 employees currently, but I started this basically on my own with one intern. And we started creating a network. And we started creating a network with farmers and talking to farmers, farmers that were actually leasing land from Natuurmonumenten. And Natuurmonumenten was talking to these farmers and saying, look, we want to move to agriculture that is emitting less nitrogen, that is increasing biodiversity, and that is closing nutrient cycles. And they've been talking about it, but they didn't really get to any action. And what we did is we brought the action in the network. So we asked these farmers, if you hear this transition of farming, what is it that you could do on your farm tomorrow that will contribute to this perspective? And these farmers, they started talking about, well, maybe we can have our soils, keep our soils healthy with less inputs, less nitrogen, less fertilizer, less chemicals that we use in improve biodiversity in the grasslands. Next slide, please. And we started making all these experiments. So we are setting up a small scale experiments with improving soil biology. We do herbal grasslands and biodiversity restoration on the farms. We set up pilots with carbon sequestration, regenerative agriculture, herbal grasslands, CO2 capture, even projects on, because soil subsidence is really, really a very, very big elephant in the room, I would say. But from these small pilots, there's a lot of positive energy. So because you get to the action, and nature protection people as well as farmers are in the same community, learning on all these activities, what we can do to improve, taking small steps, but improving biodiversity. We have now approximately 900 hectares of grasslands being brought into the project, and they're under long-term improved management. But it also helps that from the projects, the farmers actually see in the pilots what works for them, and then they roll it out over the whole farm. So we have several farmers that have said, oh, look, I want to transition my farm. Can you help me transition my farm? And then we make nature, ecological and economical business plans for these. Oh, shit. Oh, sorry. My connection's going, I think. Okay, I hope I'm still here. Next slide, please. Yeah. Can we have the next? Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought I messed up my. But I would like to just make one remark. I think what is very important is that we have this great project and all these projects that LIFE has been supporting in the LIFE program on restoration of biodiversity, was really directed towards the natural zones. And what we really need is to take on this broader perspective, and this broader perspective on how agriculture and farm nature actually interconnect. And connecting to what Theo Wams said earlier, that these buffer zones around the natural zones, where the land is privately owned by farmers, the only way to really improve biodiversity is to bring the farmers on board. And I've noticed that there is so much energy within the farming community if you pick the right tone of voice. So it's a combination, I think, of the lure of the legislation, of how do you say it? The perspective that they get from farming differently, and bringing that economic perspective as well. So we are working towards ecosystem services, payments for ecosystem services. We're working towards payments for carbon sequestration, payments for increasing biodiversity. We have to take on this broader perspective, and also a very personal approach on creating these learning communities with farmers. And I think it would be really, really good if Life could take on board that perspective. Thank you. I would leave it to here, Bas. Thanks. Back to you.
Thanks a lot, Danielle. And you were all online, so we heard it all. We heard it all. I don't. Maybe from your side you felt there was a disconnection, but there was no problem from our side. So we could hear it all. So thanks a lot. Maybe just one question, because you're absolutely right. Trying to put the people together and have a much more, I would say, human approach to this issue. But that sounds nice, of course. But when we are talking about peatland, for example, what we know, what is very important, if we think of carbon sequestration, but also for biodiversity, it's re-wetting the peatlands, which from a farmer's perspective is just giving up your land. So you can be nice and all that, but if you have the feeling, I just have to give up my land, how do you approach that?
That's what I said. It's really the elephant in the room. It's very difficult for farmers to. We had a meeting in 2019 on the Wij.land strategy, and we involved the farmers in the strategy team, and they said, look, inundating the land is just a no-go. It's not something that we will be able to discuss. But they said we do want to know what we can contribute to mitigating climate change from a farming perspective. And there's actually a lot of variability in the drainage of the peatlands. So there is room for setting up water tables, but still having possibilities to farm. But then farmland is so expensive. So if the land becomes less productive, then we have to take that loss somewhere. And this is where I think we are looking into public-private partnerships to see if we can devaluate the land, partly devaluate the land, still use it for very extensive forms of agriculture, because the farmers, they don't switch to taifa farming or azolla farming if they're a dairy farmer. They are so connected, they're rooted in this they're ranching, they're ranchers. They're not arable farmers. So as long as there's a perspective that they can still be having cattle, and even cattle, the new role of cattle might be just to manage natural zones, because natural zones need to be managed as well. They need to be grazed over. So it's the way Holland really came to this landscape. So bringing that perspective, but then still having the room to experiment with this. There are very, very front-runner farmers that say, look, I'm willing to experiment with this. I'm willing to go. We need these pinpoints. We need these examples, and then bring the community around it. And we need financial mechanisms to make it available for them.
Sure. So that's still quite some requirements there.
Yes.
That's probably a good moment to bring in everyone for the panel discussion. So we welcome back everyone that you have heard until now, and you see them popping up there. So Humberto, good to see you again. Angelo, I only see, and there we are, complete. Angelo, I don't know your setting. We don't see you. It seems that your camera, you may have the camera. Yes, now it's pointing in the right direction. we just saw your desk, I guess, but now we see you. So everyone is there. Good to see everyone. And thanks everyone for explaining live from the Commission side, from the EU side, and then also all the experiences on the ground. Probably one of the most important question is, if we are looking towards the new biodiversity strategy and all the restoration targets that are going to be proposed by the Commission, looking into the Netherlands, and we now have, I think, a number of protected area around 16%. The aim of the Commission is that it's going to be enlarged to 30%, which basically is doubling of protected area in a country like the Netherlands. I would be curious how the panelists are thinking of how can we achieve that in the coming 10 years, and then of course also how life can contribute to that. But I think it is going to be quite of a challenge for a country like the Netherlands. So probably good to hear your views on that. Maybe I start with Theo. And then let's see on who wants to jump in there. But I think Theo from Natuurmonumenten, it's your job to have a very good answer on that question, isn't it?
Well, let's hope so. Well, at first, I'm very happy. We didn't coordinate, the three of us, Danielle, Hetty, and me, but I think there was some kind of a line in these three presentations, and there is a dear obligation for all of us as civilized countries to protect nature and to see nature as something that is very valuable. And if we do the wrong things, it will get hurt. But the new way of thinking is nature-based solutions, nature not just as something that needs to be protected, but also as something that helps us for economic purposes, for health of people, for water management. And that's the next thing. And if you put that into a spatial perspective, like Danielle and well, we all three did actually, we see that the favorable conservation status of the Natura 2000 habitats is often more threatened by what happens in what Danielle calls the mixed zone, or what I call the transition zone, rather than in the habitats or in the nature reserve itself. We even see in the Netherlands some places where we could say we have over-management. We do so much management inside the habitats that they could even get hurt by that. So we need to think about the broader spatial perspective about these mixed zones, where, and you might be maybe a bit surprised, but I'm not saying as a nature conservationist, get rid of the farmers in those zones and make them into nature reserves. No, I say work together with the farmers in the way, well, Danielle is talking about forerunners, but they are setting the scene for the future. And we need, it doesn't just need to be voluntary, because it has to be in some kind of rational, spatial. That is one of the big things for how do we get these processes. We need policy instruments, we need financial instruments. And well, my question to the others would be, what could be the setup of, well, CO2 payments, nature conservation payments, agricultural payments, how to integrate, combine, etc.
Maybe that's a question for Humberto, but I would like to make it two questions to you, Humberto. First of all, because indeed that was a very clear red thread through the different presentations. It's the importance of this transition in between, right? I mean, probably we really need to go beyond the black and white discussion, or you have nature, biodiversity here, and there you have human activity, and that's it. Probably this transition zone is crucial in between. How will that be addressed into a new nature restoration laws, given the importance of that transition zone or mixed zone or whatever the terminology will be? And the second question is indeed about financing, payments. I think everyone mentioned that as well. It's the famous ecosystem goods and services, and we all know that there some kind of payment mechanism will be needed. I'm not saying Europe should do the payment by itself, because much of the money is still also at the national level, but maybe some ideas on incentivizing these kind of schemes that could also be very helpful. So, Humberto, on these two issues, what is the Commission going to solve?
Well, thank you. Let me first start by the issue of protected areas to clarify one point. this goal of 30% protected areas on land, on sea, is not necessarily 30% on each country to begin with, because the biogeographical situation or the nature as such in different countries is very different. So for the Netherlands, it might be difficult to go to 30% on land. You still have the sea to look at, because usually protected areas in the ocean, properly managed, they deliver for fisheries, at least in the outskirts of the protected areas. And there even strict protection can be a good approach on the ocean, because it leads to passive restoration, which means more fish in not many years. So that was the first point to clarify. The second issue is indeed this view of integration is very important. I mean, we should not see, as maybe some countries outside Europe where human pervasive presence everywhere is less influential in part of the land. In some countries, you see protected areas as exclusion zones of human activities, and then you have the rest. Well, in Europe, that's not the way it goes. We cherish farmers in Natura 2000 areas, of course, dealing with activities that are not only compatible, in some cases they are required to maintain the nature we have in Europe. So I pretty much endorse this view that we need not to just preach to farmers what they should do or tell them they are doing everything wrong, but to engage in first a farmers to farmers discussion, also a buy-in towards this transition. And here I would move to the funding issue and maybe a couple of reflections, let's say, on the common agriculture policy. When it started, what was the main concern in Europe? It was food security. The world wars were still relatively close. But while time evolves, societal expectations from farming also evolve. And nowadays, I think of course, the food and quality food remains. For many Europeans, healthy and quality food sounds like natural food, whatever that means for every one of us. But there is this expectation of more services of landscape, nature, climate coming from farming. And we should keep in mind that CAP's money is not farmers' money, it's taxpayers' money to begin with. So there must be an alignment between what the public overall expects and what farmers expect and can deliver. So this dialogue is indeed very important. And this key word of transition is the way to put it. I do believe that some farming activities are actually compatible, including with to some extent, some recovery of wetlands. And indeed, I do think there's a new role for cattle. You know, nowadays, cattle and meat consumption is very much on the spotlight as always negative, while we do know that there are activities of regenerative grazing, not only in the Netherlands. In my own country, I'll tell you why we have these huge wildfires. It's because herbivores are no longer there to the extent they should be naturally, and that can be mimicked by appropriate farming. So I think there's room for transition. We need indeed to find ways to finance the loss or the income loss, or especially to pay in other forms the activity of farmers. They are still producing food and fiber, but also producing other deliverables. And I think the Netherlands, I've seen some results-based approaches for payment that can be inspiring, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Humberto. Angelo, maybe going into these transition zones, these mixed zones, are there many experiences in life projects on that? The importance of restoring biodiversity in those transition zones?
Yep, there are. And once again, Humberto may confirm, we have been sort of pushing and precursor in that area, because the Habitats Directive, but also the Birds Directive, they both prescribe that when we talk about a network, that there are elements that indeed make this network work in an ecological way. So indeed what you call transition or buffer zones, ecological connectivity, so the corridors, stepping stones. So there are a number of definitions for various functions that land or sea can do to make these islands, this archipelago, which is Natura 2000, really work as a network. And we have started already in the early 2000s, going away from the classical paradigm, we only finance nature conservation in the perimeter of the Natura 2000 sites. So And since more than 10 years now, we allow actions outside Natura 2000, including land purchase outside Natura 2000. And without knowing about the famous 30% target, because it didn't exist at the time, we said to our beneficiary, okay, I give you money, you invested outside Natura 2000, but since this is not Natura 2000 and it's not going to be Natura 2000, we want you to secure a certain level of protection by the end of the project for that piece of land, whatever is the most appropriate, whether it's legal, contractual, and so on. Those contributing even before the 30% was there, to the 30% target, if you want. Now we are looking at the figures. I can tell you that I was looking during the last evaluation at 2 projects that we are going to finance. One of them will deliver alone 150,000 hectares more of sea Natura 2000 sites on top. So it's a 0 point whatever it is of the famous 30%. It's peanuts, but this is the beauty of life. We work by peanuts. One peanut after the other, we get a big cake. And I wouldn't be surprised that 10 years from now we say, but 1% of that famous 30% was done only by Life Project, which is in itself a nice way to show that the money we invest in Natura 2000 always delivers a square meter more.
Yeah, building it up from the peanuts, as you said, Angelo.
Yeah.
Maybe Hetty, maybe this is also a question on the payment for services. Do you have experience that from a water management perspective? How do you see that evolving in your experience in making sure that there will be kind of payment mechanisms for ecosystem goods and services there?
Mm-hmm. Well, we thought about this as water authorities, but it's very difficult to include this in our tax system, for example, because it's very particular which goods you're going to transfer. So I think we must aim at more things like subsidies or something like that as a policy to help this transition. And of course, I'm not an expert on business cases in agriculture, but I'm an expert in business cases in water management, and not everything is possible in the Netherlands anymore. So, well, I don't believe in fairy tales. We also have to make choices in the Netherlands, and we have to act again as spatial planners. And we can't do everything everywhere. So, as water authorities, we say, let the soil and water speak when you're planning in your environment. So that's not exactly an answer to your question, but it's also some limit to what we can do even in a man-made land in the Netherlands.
No, well, I think that's important as well, of course. I mean, you hear that quite often from politicians, everything is win-win and we can only have the positive story. But I think indeed, in the end, it's also important. There are limits. There are limits what we can, certainly in a country like the Netherlands.
And multifunctional sounds very nice, but not possible everywhere.
But no, that's true.
If I may chip in, it's we have been financing a few, not that many, projects that had as an aim trying to set up a mechanism, ecosystems pay type of mechanism. Mildly successful, if you want. I'm still failing to see one single water bill that comes to the household and says, you are paying that much for your water, and this amount of money goes to protect that forest or whatever other thing, natural system that is protecting your water table, from which the water that you are taking from the tap is coming. And the funny thing is that the relation between that piece of land, that piece of nature, and the water sometimes is really one-to-one. You can physically establish it. So this idea that I understand what Hetty says, that because of the fiscal mechanism, because of the legislation and so on, I think it's a pretty much a sort of hiding behind the finger of our authorities. I believe it's absolutely possible. They simply don't want to do it. That's probably the unfortunate reply.
I think that was also part why Hetty was saying it was difficult. It's also because of lack of political willingness. That's certainly behind that as well, Danielle, because we also get some questions meanwhile from our audience, and we touched upon it already a bit. It's what you also called the elephant in the room. But maybe since your experience in talking also to farmers, is it economically viable for farmers to really move away from intensive farming? Looking at our current agriculture system that we are having, because when we are talking about more transition zones, mixed zones, where nature and agriculture activities come together, then probably intensive farming cannot fit there. But is it economically viable for farmers to move away from that?
That's a good question. So we have seen some really good examples already from very extensively managed farms. But usually these farmers find niche markets for their products as well. Excuse me.
Working from home, we all know it.
Yeah. 5 minuten. And I don't think for the majority of the farmers, it's very difficult, because even if they would like to buy land to extensify, as well as the milk factory as well as the bank will ask these farmers to come up with a business plan and to prove that they can actually finance this as well. So we have built a whole system around dairy farming that actually moves farmers towards intensification. They hear every time from the bank, from their advisors, from the milk factory, that they need to provide a little bit more milk, use more inputs, and produce more outputs. And it's a system that offers the farmers security, because if they manage the farm in this way, they will know what they will get in the end, which is not a huge amount of money. Let's not, it's not easy to make a decent living being a relatively small scale dairy farmer in the Netherlands. Sometimes they earn below moderate incomes, but it's a way of life almost. On the other hand, taking more risks. There are farmers that are wanting to take more risks, finding niche markets for their products and selling and doing very, very, very well. So we need a system change. We need to put out these examples and make a case to see if it's really viable to transition to this very extensive farming. And we need to build another system around the advisors and the banks and looking at farming models in a different way. So we need really different ways of financing these farms. And we must also not forget that there will be a huge opportunity, because there's a lot of dairy farmers that don't have a successor. In the coming decades, there's a lot of land will be freed, also in the area where we are working. And if we do nothing, the land will be bought by the highest bidder, and land is very expensive in the Netherlands, so that will lead to more intense farming, because you will need to take a lot of produce from the land. But if you build another system around that, if you can acquire the land and allow for extensive land use and not really taking everything, milking the land really, then we can find different models. Yeah.
Maybe that brings me to Humberto again. When we are talking about restoration and nature restoration, maybe there is a role indeed also for financial institutions in the EU who may not be used to thinking of these kind of finance models. Are there ideas within the Commission to also include financial institutions more into the issues of biodiversity and nature restoration?
Well, yes, indeed, and not only since the Green Deal, even before, but more after the Green Deal. To give an example of before, we do have this natural capital financial facility established with live money, actually with the EIB, which exactly tried to target those profit-generating or cost-reducing projects using nature to deliver. Which is, of course, it's a new area. So many good ideas, not all of them bankable, but it did establish it's possible, and there was some lovely projects on that. Then if you see the whole approach of the EIB turning into a climate bank. And if you really want to tackle climate, you will also need to tackle nature. That's another push for that. And we do see nowadays a lot, well, of business to begin with. Well, just look to the World Economic Forum and their messages on how much the economy depends on nature. There are many businesses coming into wanting to know there's risks and dependencies of natural capital, including nature biodiversity, that's kicking in, and including from financial institutions. We have this business and biodiversity platform for long, which has a community of practice, as we call it, with financial institutions on biodiversity. So I think that's starting, but now it's still a bit of a niche indeed. We need to expand this into the whole economic system, and I do believe that natural capital accounting will have a role on that.
And another question that we get, well, you are in a webinar on biodiversity with Dutch audience, so then immediately you get water management questions, of course. So one of the questions is, will water quantity and quality, will that be in your proposal for the nature restoration targets? And how will that be linked to the existing Water Framework Directive, of course?
Okay, well, of course, I can tell you one thing. We very clearly spotted first the Birds and Habitats Directive, how they could entail for this restoration targets. But the second in the row was the Water Framework Directive. And the third, by the way, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, because they all imply restoration. If you want to get to good ecological status, you need to restore water ecosystems included. So in a nutshell, it's certainly covered under our impact assessment, these approaches. And I would expect that indeed we will have water-related nature restoration targets. There are many win-wins from water-related restoration, as was clear during this presentation, including examples by Angelo. So I would expect that to be covered indeed.
And it also, it replies a bit to your concern, Theo, right? When you were saying there is already so much nature restoration into the policy framework, but then let's make sure that new proposals are complementary to that and building on those restoration. And well, if I hear Humberto very well, that's what the Commission is intending to do, at least.
Well, it is crucial. We see that one of the biggest threats to the favorable status of our Natura 2000 sites, besides nitrogen, is let's say a broken hydrological system in the landscape more at large. So we need, for a sustainable future of these habitats, we need restoration of this hydrology, but that implies consequences for farmers who are working there. So we're back with Hetty, with her water board. We're with Danielle, who's working with the farmers, and both regulations, national but also European ones, and financial, let's say, systems that support that well, that's the thing we're looking for, and I think we're all looking for it in this phase.
Yeah. And maybe one final question for you still, Theo, because that's talking about instruments. We have, of course, in the Netherlands, we have land consolidation, ruilverkaveling, as it's in the beautiful Dutch language, which in our history was, of course, used to, well, create spaces for agriculture where you got the intensive agriculture. Maybe we could use these kind of instruments. That's basically the spatial planning that also Hetty was referring to, that we should do much more, is that we use this kind of land consolidation instruments also for creating these transition zones more than we have done until now. Do you see options for that, to have these kind of policy instruments, which is then should be arranged more at the national level, of course? Was this to me or to Hetty? It was for you, Theo. Yes.
Oh, yes. I was really interested to see what Hetty would say about this. But I'll be very brief.
And then I let Hetty do the closing point. Yeah.
Well, my brief answer is yes, and it matters what you do where. So if you restore hydrology, it matters where you do that. So there needs to be a spatial element, and even sometimes a spatial element of coercion, I think. But now it's up to Hetty, because she's much more important in that field.
Well, we are all important in this field, because only together we can recover biodiversity, of course. Let's state at first that this is all within the boundaries of our democratic processes. And go as fast as this process is leading us. So this said, I think that a next step in ruilverkaveling would be a very good step, but we have to look more to more perspective than only agriculture and nature. We also have to keep in mind that we are building societies. If we change the agriculture techniques in our lands, then the landscape is changing, but also the society. And we have to keep that in mind and invest also in the people and in the societal framework. So yes, but not only as a technical exercise coming from a mathematical engineer.
Maybe then I do give the final word to Humberto, because in the Green Deal, in the climate perspective, there's also the so-called Climate Pact, which is deliberately put there because we all know that also climate action, you don't get that with regulation only, you also need to get the people on the ground delivering on it. For biodiversity, it's not there in the plans yet. I mean, there will be new laws coming up, but there's no biodiversity pact in the planning yet, which would be there to include the people in order to make it happen. Is that something that could still be coming, or is that for you a clear part of the laws that are coming up?
In fact, for me, I think it's a clear path of what's coming, because it's really a fact, not just wishful thinking, that you cannot deal with climate without dealing with nature. You just need nature to deliver many of the services for climate purposes, including mitigation, using the carbon sinks. So I'm pretty much on the side of not being worried if someone is speaking only climate, provided it's the full challenge of climate change. I think the Climate Pact, we can see it as a token for an environmental pact, including biodiversity. And more than this, it's for a long time, I would say public opinion would perceive climate impacts and thus sustain climate policy. And we could claim, well, but biodiversity impacts, they are not so noticeable. But nowadays they are. Some of them are. First, you have forest fires. When you see koalas burning in Australia, that does trigger some emotions on nature. Then we have this perception, well, plastic in the ocean is not directly a biodiversity problem, but it comes to the minds of people because of the impact on marine life, from whales to seabirds. And we have this essence, insects disappearing to a large extent in natural landscapes. Well, people not necessarily love insects, but they certainly don't like the idea of insects disappearing from our practices. So I think biodiversity will necessarily be ingrained in whatever we do on the climate and beyond.
Thanks. That's probably a good concluding remark on this webinar, bringing nature back through life, back to life and through life. I really would like to thank all the panelists that you see here. It's a big round of applause, which always has to be done virtually, but really would like to thank from the Commission, Humberto and Angelo, and really, I really hope that we can see a lot more great examples coming from the LIFE projects, and of course also Theo, Hetty and Danielle from your experience in really bringing people together in order to do nature restoration. And we're not there yet. We certainly have a lot of challenges, certainly also in the Netherlands. But I think these examples, and with this support from the EU, we hopefully can really bring nature back to life and to the levels that we want to have it. And I think I would like to thank all of you for contributing to that, and certainly also for participating in this webinar. And I hope to see you all very soon again in order to keep on working on these issues, because they're vital to our future. So thank you once more. And also thank you to the audience for listening to it. I'm sure it can also be rewatched at a certain moment. I have no idea how and when, but you will be seeing that popping up, I'm sure. And for that, I would like to wish everyone a very good week and a good Monday for what is left of it. And thank you once more to the panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.